All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to imagine a world where the devil doesn't just have horns, but shows up as this bizarre, feathered fiend or some grotesque hybrid born straight out of human sin. We're stepping into the mind of an artist who dared to visualize divine judgment, not with hushed, polite whispers, but with absolute, total chaos. Because we're not just looking at simple moral parables here. No, we are stepping into a riotous, nightmarish carnival of flesh and fire. This artwork wrestled incredibly hard with faith and the constant looming specter of damnation that completely haunted the late medieval mind. It is literally a fever dream put to canvas, showcasing all of humanity's follies writ large across these fantastical, impossible landscapes. Which really makes you wonder, right? Who exactly was this architect of the absurd? How did an artist dare to paint what other people only imagined in their absolute darkest hours? His life is this tantalizing historical puzzle, and it remains almost as obscure as the strange, creeping creatures that populate his masterpieces. Part 1. Enter the fever dream. Investigating the scene. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This was a massive period of transition. The lines between the sacred and profane? Yeah, they were completely blurred. On one hand, the rigid, old medieval world was starting to fray at the edges, and you had the humanist focus of the Renaissance just beginning to stir. But on the other hand, especially in the northerly regions, the church still wielded immense power, and the fear of eternal damnation felt like a palpable, everyday, physical force. People were just constantly obsessing over their capacity for great virtue and profound wickedness. So who was actually capturing all of this intense anxiety? Let's get into part 2. The man behind the monsters, a surprising suspect. Okay, so our guy was born around 1450 in the bustling Dutch city of Salvador Bosch, and his real name was actually Hieronymus van Aken. Now, surprisingly, he wasn't some solitary madman locked away in a dark cellar. Art back then was a highly regulated trade. Working right inside the guild system, young Bosch learned the ropes from his father and his grandfather. He used this incredibly keen eye to absorb literally everything around him. The boisterous revelry of urban festivals, the grim reality of solemn public punishments, and the humble piety of his community. He took all of these everyday sensory inputs and used them as the raw materials for his utterly unique art. But here is the absolute wildest paradox of his existence. On the one hand, you've got this super respectable citizen. He married a wealthy merchant's daughter, Aleid van de Merwen, which hooked him up with immense financial stability. He was even a member of the illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady, a deeply orthodox religious confraternity dedicated to the Virgin Mary. But somehow, out of this deeply traditional, super comfortable life, poured the most grotesque, bizarre, and seemingly heretical artistic output you could possibly imagine. So you kind of have to ask this central question. What was his deal? Was he a strict moralist, a satirist, or maybe a secret heretic? We really have to figure out if he was using these terrifying visions just to warn humanity about the consequences of their actions, or if he was subtly subverting church doctrines as a hidden non-believer. Or maybe he was just functioning as a dark philosopher of his age. To find the answers, we need to look at the evidence he left behind. Part 3. Decoding Earthly Delights, the Prime Evidence. And honestly, there is no better proof than his absolute magnum opus, The Garden of Earthly Delights. It's like a giant, terrifying puzzle. He meticulously orchestrated these vast, hyper-realistic figures in oil paint across 3 distinct panels. The left panel gives us this seemingly serene Eden, but if you look closely, subtle little hints of corruption are already lurking right beneath the surface. Then the center explodes into this riotous, bewildering panorama of human indulgence and sensual activities. It's a visual feast of sin that actually leaves you feeling kind of unsettled and hollow. And finally, the right panel plunges us straight into a stark, apocalyptic hellscape of eternal punishment. Within that terrifying right panel, things just get totally unhinged. Bosch doesn't just paint regular fire and brimstone. No, he takes everyday inanimate objects and gives them this malevolent life. Everyday musical instruments literally become instruments of torture. Monstrous creatures just casually devour the damned. It reveals this perverse playfulness and a pitch-black humor that elevates his work miles beyond the simple, clear religious instruction that his contemporaries were doing. But seriously, where on earth do these monstrous amalgamations actually come from? Part 4. Symbols, Sources, and Secrets. Deciphering the Codes.
Well, his inspirations were actually totally rooted in his daily culture. He was pulling heavily from medieval bestiaries, which back then were these widely read collections of real and mythical animals. He also looked straight to the New Testament's book of Revelation for all its celestial battles, and he definitely listened to the dramatic, fiery sermons of his era. But the genius part is he didn't just illustrate these existing ideas. He completely reassembled them. He twisted texts and folklore into his very own visual mythology that spoke directly to the deep anxieties of his age. Once you start decoding his unique universe, the whole thing starts to click. Take the owl, for example. Often hidden away in dark corners of his paintings, it actually represents both wisdom and the devil's heresy, a creature of the night strongly associated with ignorance. Then you have those massive musical instruments in his hellscapes. Those symbolize the loud distractions of earthly temptations leading our souls astray. And finally, the cracked eggs. They represent this fragile, delicate corruption, always threatening to hatch into something monstrous.
You see this even more intensely in another prime piece of evidence, the temptation of St. Anthony. This triptych pushes his boundless imagination completely off the charts. Instead of generic guys with pitchforks, we get these delightfully bizarre mashups, a hollowed-out human body stuffed full of instruments, a bird-headed man casually riding a frog-like creature. Each of these impossibly strange beings is designed to embody very specific, tangible sins and temptations that the desert ascetic had to face.
Which brings us to the end of the puzzle, Part 5, A Mirror to Humanity, the Final Verdict.
The crazy thing is, while his immediate influence was pretty localized, his true impact exploded centuries later, in the 20th century. Surrealist artists like Salvador Dalí and Max Ernst absolutely devoured his work. They immediately recognized Bosch as a kindred spirit, a true master of the uncanny. They saw in his dreamlike alien visions the perfect precursor to their own explorations of the subconscious, basically proving his work was light years ahead of its time.
So the climax of our investigation reveals a pretty powerful truth. He wasn't just some random madman painting isolated horrors for shock value. Actually, scratch that. He was a brilliant craftsman who synthesized all the complex spiritual and moral debates of his community. He took the completely abstract fears of damnation that his society held so deeply, and he made them terrifyingly, viscerally concrete. So if you take away only one thing from this explainer, let it be this. Bosch gave a face to formless fears. His art functions as a mirror, mapping out our own ongoing, messy internal battles with temptation, morality, and the search for meaning. He proved, for sure, that the human capacity for both breathtaking divine creation and base, brutal destruction is a historical constant. It runs right through the centuries. He was, fundamentally, a master of the human condition.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. Are you ready to face the angel, the devil, and the totally bizarre creature that resides within us all? Because in the end, the true legacy of Hieronymus Bosch isn't just the oil paint on the canvas. It's the deeply unsettling questions he forces us to ask ourselves about our own true nature.